Hey there, and welcome to That Bond Show, the internet's #1 James Bond rewatch show hosted by two guys named Logan and Trevor. Probably. And also That Nerdy Site's newest series. Join us as every week we discuss a new Bond movie from Dr. No to No Time to Die. I'm one of your hosts, Logan Wilkinson, and joining me this week is my Phoenix son, Trevor Starkey.
I appreciate the minor little tweaks there that you put into there to actually explain what this podcast is, because I realized like halfway through last week's episode that we didn't really do that. We just kind of took it for granted that like, hey, whoever's like catching this is going to know that this is like a Bond rewatch podcast kind of thing.
Yes, this is the newest installment of the series, as this week we tackle From Russia with Love, which was released on October 10th in London, 1963, as the second Bond film.
Yeah, it was another one of those. I was looking right before we started. Didn't come out here until like
1964,
May of 1964. One of the top grossing movies of 1964, alongside the next Bond movie, which also came out in 1964.
We talked about this a little bit last week, but all of the early Bond films, honestly, not even necessarily that early, are going to have very interesting release dates. They're trying to pin on what is the exact one. As we mentioned last week, I am almost universally going to default to the London premiere date of each installment, because that's what IM Productions itself has deemed as the official release of each movie, in particular for Dr. No and the anniversary. Trevor, I don't know any of your history with this movie. Do you have any prior memory recollection of From Russia with Love?
Nope. I maybe had heard the name and stuff, but I...
Played the video game?
Nope, definitely didn't play the video game. The only Bond game I've ever played, I think, was GoldenEye, so... yeah,
solid one to play.
I knew virtually nothing about this movie coming in, and it was another one. You and I talked about this a little bit because I watched it like super early. I watched it basically like right after we recorded our last episode, and on one of our other recordings, we were talking about it a little bit. And this was another one that, much like kind of Dr. No, like, this just starts putting so much more Austin Powers stuff into focus. In particular, I mentioned that like, oh, now I can see the very clear inspiration for Frau Verbittene or whatever from Austin Powers. So yeah, it was just kind of like here's like picking and choosing more of those elements of like, oh, now I get certain pop culture references that I might not have picked up on prior to this.
Yeah, we mentioned a little bit last week, but it bears repeating just how much Mike Myers and Created Austin Powers is pulling from these like first 5 movies in particular of the Bond saga, right? Like Sean Connery's first 5. He just apes so well. He just pulls almost seemingly every single movie. Actually, I think literally every movie of the first 5, there's going to be a key character or a key location or something that's pulled into his Austin Powers series. I mean, like I mentioned last week, Mike Myers very much loved Sean Connery and loved these movies, and also I think recognized how ripe they were to kind of be parodied and made fun of at the same time. But yes, this is From Russia with Love. Trevor, of course, already kind of went over his history. For me personally, I've got a very interesting history with From Russia with Love. It was one of the early Bond movies that I maybe liked a little bit less. Certainly out of like the Connery run. It was probably only ever above or right next to kind of Dr. No territory in terms of Connery's first 5 for me as a kid growing up. And then when I did a rewatch probably like 10 years ago, back in like 2012 or something, and I rewatched them all, it finally hit me of like, holy moly, this movie's really great. And it like catapulted to being my second or third favorite Bond movie period at that time. My second favorite of Connery's. I did play the video game. I have so many nostalgic memories of playing From Russia with Love during Christmas time, peek behind the curtain when we're filming this. And so like, I'm just, like literally like being able to like smell freshly baked cookies in like the basement downstairs as I'm playing From Russia with Love, and then walking out and seeing a Christmas tree, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of memories of that as well. And yeah, this is one of my favorite certainly Sean Connery Bond movies at the very least, if not one of my favorite in general. And it was very interesting watching it again as we'll kind of get into like certain scenes being like that scene, like that 5-minute chunk or that 10-minute chunk is so good in this movie. But before we get too further into the movie itself, let's get into the cast. Of course, we have starring as James Bond, Sean Connery is returning here in his second role as Bond. Alongside him, we've got a bit more fleshed out and developed cast than Dr. No had, which really only had, it felt like 5 people in the proceedings. As Kareem Bey, we've got Pedro, let me look at this again because I didn't have it up. Pedro Armendariz, I'm going to go with. As Kareem Bey, head of Station T for Turkey, in what would be his last film role. He would actually pass away about a month after filming this, unfortunately. We've got Letta Linya as Rosa Klebb, number 3, formerly head of SMERSH, and then shifted over to SPECTRE. We've got Robert Shaw, in an iconic turn as Red Grant. Bernard Lee yet again returns as M. In his first credited appearance as M. In the last role, he was just in it, but not listed as M. Daniela Bianchi, I'm going to go with, as Tatiana Romana, or Tanya. They very quickly gave her a nickname for it. Lois Maxwell as Moneypenny. Desmond Llewellyn makes his first of many appearances as Q. And this is just a particular fun one for me. Walter Gottel is going to make appearance as Rossini here in Head of Spectre Training, but you will see him many, many times throughout the first 30 years of the Bond series as a different character a few films from now. And it was once again directed by Terrence Young in his second Bond directorial debut. In the Blast from the Past section,
real quick, I just wanted to...
You got more?
I feel like I saw this was another one of those, like, in the trivia or something, where, like, once again, they cast somebody without really, like, vetting any kind of acting chops, and so isn't it's another one that, like, the voice of Tiana or Tanya is, like, dubbed, and it's not actually
correct.
Her. Yeah.
It is, again, I think I mentioned it last week, these early Bond films, you're going to see that as a recurring feature. It'll be brought back, I think, possibly in its most famous example, next week's Bond film. But certainly here, again, it is not her actual voice. I never really remember that for this one, whereas, like, for Honey Rider, I very much know, like, that is not her voice. And for the next film, I very much am like, that is not their voice. But here it kind of, again, like you mentioned last week, it is dubbed very well. Like, I don't think you could notice it at all.
I noticed it a lot more this time around.
Oh, interesting. See, I noticed it. Maybe I just wasn't expecting it.
I didn't, like, I guess it was one of those, I didn't know if it was her just, like, redoing the lines because of, ADR of the time kind of thing, or if it was, like, another person until watching but it was definitely like, I noticed bigger differences between the syncs and stuff like that this time around. So it was, and it might also be that, like, the last one kind of prepared me to look forward a little bit more, like we've talked about. I also want to shout out, as somebody who legitimately in college took a class specifically dedicated to Bertolt Brecht, like, seeing Lotte Lenya, who was like an iconic member of Brecht's kind of, like, company of actors in his Threepenny Opera days and stuff like that. It's very, like, funny to have that context. She's, like, name dropped in Mac the Knife, which is an iconic song from Threepenny Opera as well. And so, like, just interesting seeing that, like, crossover of, like, this theater history class that I had with, like, one of the world's, like, foremost Brecht experts, and then just, like, putting that together with this context of, like, oh, and she's, like, this evil Bond villain in this movie. Just a fun little, like fun little bit of, like, nerdy theater trivia for me.
It's interesting too because I think From Russia with Love is the first Bond movie, I think that, I mean, it definitely is. There's only been one before it. It's the first Bond movie where you get into this weird dichotomy of, like, the main villain of the movie is technically Rosa Klebb, but Red Grant kind of gets so much more screen time and is so much more of a menacing presence that this is a Bond movie that people have at times a hard time placing who the villain of the film is. And when you see rankings of like who the best Bond villains are, Red Grant will pretty much always be in like the top 5 or 10, right? Rosa Club never is. But I always really liked Rosa Club. I like the fact that she, we get way more of a backstory into Spectre through her and see all of its kind of machinations, and the fact that, Red Grant listens to her, I think conveys something for like how powerful she is as well. But I like her turn a lot. She's, I think, one of the more iconic Bond villains, in particular for the final scene of her with the knife shoe, which is very much in a lot of different movies that parody Bond. So I have always really liked her turn in this as well. Mm-hmm. But in the Blast from the Past, for the last time, JFK is the president. He'd be president for about another month. After this came out, my dad, in the rolling update of the family, was 5. My mom was just a year old. And the highest grossing movie in the States, in the US, was Cleopatra. I'm maybe going to have to start specifying that because in the UK, the highest grossing movie this year was From Russia with Love. Even with its very short kind of release window, it still shattered British box office records when it came out, and was one of the highest grossing British movies of all time. But in the US, it didn't even exist at the time. It would and for another few months. So Cleopatra took the top spot. The Boston Celtics had just won their 5th consecutive NBA title in 1963, and the Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, was released on March 22nd of this year. So this James Bond predates the Beatles even by a little bit. And that will tie back into a future movie.
I guess it does. Based on that, it doesn't predate the Beatles. Like the Beatles did come out a few months before.
No, because Dr. No had already come out.
Oh, wait. You're saying the Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, was released this year. So
March 23rd of 1963. So Dr. No had come out 6 months beforehand.
Right. So I'm just saying the Beatles predate this movie, but
yes,
you're saying... Okay,
yeah,
got it.
My apologies. I see where you're coming from. Yeah. In the trivia section, yet again, stuntman Bob Simmons appears as James Bond in the opening gun barrel sequence instead of Sean Connery. And Bob Simmons actually gets a few more moments to shine. This is an extra little add-on. In this movie, he gets a few kind of uncredited appearances in this film as various kind of people doing things in the background. Bob Simmons would be kind of a staple of the 1960s Connery era Bond films. And one future movie down the line, in particular, he'll get a whole awesome fight scene with Sean Connery as a little future tease for a trivia section. From Russia with Love is the first film in the series to have both an opening credit sequence and a prologue, with obviously Red Grant hunting down James in the maze, which I always loved as a kid. It's such a cool sequence.
I was definitely confused until like they pull up the mask to reveal it was, not really James Bond. Because like my first note on this movie was cold open with Bond in a garden against some blonde guy who is incredibly nonchalant about James trying and failing miserably to shoot him. Mm-hmm. I was just like, wait, what's going on here? Like, why is Bond so bad here? And B, why is this guy just like super chill about it?
I love that sequence, especially watching it again now. I love that sequence because the moment the fake Bond shoots, Red Grant almost knows, it's like, oh, I'm in his head. This guy is terrified. Like, it's that smile of being like, I'm going to kill this guy. I'm going to win, right? Mm-hmm. Like, Robert Shaw in particular, I mean, we'll get to it down the line, but does so well with so little in this movie. And that was another example of that. Leading us directly into Robert Shaw's iconic turn as Red Grant would become the template for countless film and TV henchmen down the years, and would be the direct inspiration for 6 future blonde European silent Bond henchmen. You were going to see this template a lot in the series of just blonde, quiet, strong henchmen.
I also appreciated it because I also took a note in here that like he's effectively like a proto Dolph Lundgren type.
Yeah,
Um,
100%. That's
and
another. Yeah.
and then even just now thinking about it, and especially thinking about his turn when he like is impersonating Nash
Mm-hmm.
late in the film and whatnot, it immediately draws from Die Hard,
Oh,
Alan
yeah.
Rickman's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
um, role as like when he like pretends to be like the the Texas gentleman or whatever. It's like he's that iconic kind of element of the hero and the villain facing off, but the hero doesn't necessarily know it's the villain.
Yeah. I think Robert Shaw is fantastic in this. I think he deservedly is on a lot of the best villain and henchman lists you'll see. I mean, he set such a good, I think, template for Bond henchmen and just henchmen in like these kind of movies in general. And yeah, we'll get into it more down the line, but there is a solid 10 to 15 minute section when they're on the train that I think is one of my favorite sequences of like any Bond film. It is so good once he finally utters his first words in the last act of the film. From Russia with Love is the favorite Bond movie of Sean Connery, as well as Timothy Dalton and Daniel Craig, making it the Bond actor's most popular pick. It is also Bond producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson's favorite Bond film, and one of Cubby Broccoli's 3 favorite Bond films. So it is a very popular pick among the Bond cast. Although it was not released until late in 1963, this movie was the year's biggest box office success in Britain, as I mentioned earlier, beating out Tom Jones, The Great Escape, and The Birds, all of which were released in the summer. In the 82 days between its premiere in London and the end of 1963, it became the most lucrative movie of any kind ever released in British cinemas. This really being the movie that put the Bond series and Sean Connery in particular on the map. The brutal fight in the train compartment between James Bond and Donald Red Grant lasts only a few minutes on screen, but took 3 weeks to film. In addition, it was almost entirely done by the actors themselves, which I think you will see when you watch a film, and is a marked improvement from the fights in the prior film, Dr. No, which Trevor gave lots of hard times to. Finally, From Russia with Love is among the most critically acclaimed Bond films ever made, appearing near or at the top of numerous Bond rankings, and is also commonly listed as one of the greatest British films ever made by numerous outlets. I think tying back into how beloved it is among the various Bond actors themselves. From Russia with Love is rad. It's a really good movie. It's also a video game, which is not in the trivia section, but we've already talked on before. And as a little bit of trivia for that, it is Sean Connery's last performance as obviously James Bond, but also in general. He had retired from acting after The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in 2001? And then came back for one final performance here in From Russia with Love. And as a fun little extra trivia fact, that they actually decided to update his voice in the game to kind of reflect the fact that Sean Connery is obviously older than he was, and he was 33 years old in 2005. From Russia with Love is rad. That's a great video game. Next, we've got our 70-second recap. This should be a breeze. I timed this earlier. I should have so much time to spare.
We skipped over this last time, so I was like, I didn't know if we were doing this bit anymore.
We'll do it, yeah. We kind of run over the recap of the film. Hit the timer. A little timer icon pops up.
It doesn't, but I'll certainly kind of like keep an eye on it.
Spectre devises a plot to turn the East and West against each other, while also getting revenge on James Bond for the death of Dr. No in the previous film. Bond heads out to Istanbul, where he meets Karim Bey and his many sons, and is steeped in the world of Cold War espionage. Sent into a trap, Bond meets Tanya, a Soviet clerk who's unknowingly working for Spectre, and who can offer MI6 the Lecter coding machine. Bond, Tanya, and Karim get the machine and ride a train out of Dodge, where Red Grant shows up, kills Karim and an MI6 agent to steal his identity, before getting in a brutally great fight with Bond in a train compartment, Afterwards, Bond and Tanya escape, ride a boat, and get into a final kickin' good scene with Rosa Klebb. I think I smashed the 70 seconds.
Yeah, that was about 45 to 50 seconds.
Plenty of time to go. Trevor, this is your next hosting segment here.
Yeah.
How many people were killed?
How many people do you think Bond killed in this movie?
So again, I really want to do I really hope like you might already have it done of like the cumulative total for like each Bond actor too, because my guess would be of any Bond that appears in more than one movie, so like not counting George Lazenby, my prediction is Sean Connery will be at the bottom of the list just based on what his movies are. Mm-hmm. But in this one, I think James. I mean, I guess it's kind of it can get a little wonky because of like the Gypsy and Bulgar fight. But like certainly people that he kills. He kills Red Grant. He doesn't kill Rosa Klebb. He kills the two guys in the helicopter. I'm not gonna count the like dudes in boats because to me like they just fell out of the water, right? Like it's not necessarily clear if they're dead or not, right? I'm gonna err on the side of conservative. So I'm gonna say Bond killed, counting the Gypsy fight, like I'll say 7 people.
I mean, I'll give you that because this thing didn't count the Gypsy fight at all. Okay. Didn't count any of those deaths, I don't think. It only counted Red Grant and it counted Merzeni, who's like the head of the guys in the boat fight. And then I kind of made the additional note of like plus all the other guys in the boats, but who knows how many of those were or whatever. Yeah. So this didn't even also recognize and I'd forgotten about it until you brought it up, the helicopter guys. So even that's like the element of, well, he shot them, but like it was their grenade that killed them. It's kind of like it's iffy and there's definitely not a clear cut count here. This count only really kind of identified two, and this I think also is focusing specifically on named characters, so that's why it only highlights those two. The kills kind of beyond that. You have the James Bond double strangled by Grant at the top. Krillenko is shot by Karam Bey. Rhoda and Benz are killed off screen by Grant. As is Ali Karam Bey killed off screen by Grant. Tov Kronstein is stabbed by Morenzi with the poison spike shoe. And then lastly, Rosa Klebb, they're shot by Tatiana Romanova.
It is probably one of the movies in the series with the smallest body count, which I think ties into the kind of movie it's trying to be, which we can just hop right into. I mean, Trevor, what were your reactions and thoughts on From Russia with Love?
Overall, I thought it was a good movie. I thought it was a step up from Dr. No, especially in terms of like what I expect or what I think of from a Bond movie, like kicking off with Q basically saying like, here's the briefcase and here's all the gadgets and stuff that it has. I was then set up to like expect and know that each of those things was going to somehow come back into play throughout the rest of the film. So I was able to kind of like appreciate like the foreshadowing / like laying the groundwork for those elements. I very much enjoyed kind of the like looming threat of Grant not really understanding what his like game was going to be, especially when like he saves Bond in the Gypsy fight and stuff. And like my note there I think was like he saves him so that he may kill him later or something like that. But it was also kind of like, well, then why didn't he just shoot him like then? Or like he's very much a like a cat playing with the mouse kind of like imagery, and ultimately of course that kind of like leads to his downfall. He gets cocky in that regard and all that stuff. But then especially when he does kind of go and it's also, I mean, there's also it didn't highlight, or my kill count didn't have this, but presumably he also kills Nash
for sure.
off the real Nash off screen there. And so like when he does that and kind of like assumes like that persona, like we finally get a glimpse of this guy, but he's like, we also get that he's like playing a character. And I love that like there are elements in that performance that could have / should have tipped off Bond, like the red wine with fish or whatever, and the like overuse of old man, kind of like playing into that like he's too in character or whatever, and I really enjoyed kind of their back and forth as a result.
Yep.
Then kind of beyond that, I appreciated the like, obviously I know just as a knower of pop culture that the number one character that we get introduced to this is Blofeld, but like obviously we don't know that he's Blofeld yet.
Number one is just a question mark in the credits.
Yeah.
I don't know if you caught that.
Yeah, and I saw that like it's played by the actor who played Dent last time around.
Yep.
So yeah, I appreciated that, and just kind of the like like the world building of Spectre for a degree there of like I appreciated, especially off of like really enjoying the Queen's Gambit last year, which is a chess centric story set in this time frame, like the opening there sequence of like the chess thing, and Kronstein kind of getting that like hidden Spectre note with his water or whatever, and he's like, we need you now, and so he's basically like, all right, I'm done playing this game, and he just like does the checkmate kind of move. And there was an element, because it's not clear to to the player or to the audience what's happening in that scene, so I was like, is he just throwing the tournament here, or oh no, he has the move, he can like end this right now kind of thing. And so I appreciate that like he's kind of like this brain, and he's like approaching this whole thing as like a chess game, and I appreciate that like that lack of ruthlessness that Kleb has, as a borderline KGB kind of like, or preach KGB kind of like personality, like that ultimately leads to his own downfall, is like he thinks he's this grandmaster here in the game of life, but he can't account for all the variables of Bond. And so like I appreciated just like that, the inner workings of Spectre that we see here as well. Like he's number 5, Kleb's number 3, Blofeld's number 1, and kind of all that stuff that's set up there. There were certainly elements where I was like, I don't know why we're spending so much time at this gypsy camp thing. And we'll talk about that later, and kind of the like, what doesn't really hold up in this day and age. But like overall, I appreciated there was another kind of like detective following the clues mystery kind of at the center of a lot of this. I will say I did not like Tatiana, like I did not like, I thought this performance was a significant step down compared to like Honey Rider from last week, personally.
Interesting. Okay.
And I don't know if it was that, or just like I just didn't like the chemistry between Bond and her just didn't work for me, or felt like really forced, really fast, really fake. And like there's an element of it that is okay, well, she's under orders to like seduce him or whatever, but it was just like it was missing a few steps to make it a believable relationship. So I never bought what we're supposed to think by the end of this movie, that she has like really fallen for him. Like in no way was that sold to me. So it was just kind of like I know for what they're saying, what they're talking about, that's what's going on in this movie, but like they have not shown me that element, or if they tried to show me, like it's like the closest you get to that maybe is the fun little banter that they have while he's recording her on the boat. And you hear that whole thing back at like MI6 headquarters or whatever. Like that's the closest you get, but even there it's like, I mean, she's supposed to be a spy herself. So like, is she selling the bit, or like, it was just kind of like, it wasn't clearly set up where her allegiance truly lied in any of this, throughout the entirety of it. So like, even the end when she's like, she fights off and saves Bond from Kleb, I'm just kind of like, okay, that didn't really feel earned, but I knew that was where it was going to go. So that's probably the biggest thing that like drags the movie down a little bit for me, was I did not like buy into that central relationship that is, part of the plot. It is part of kind of the momentum of what Bond is after to get this whole thing moving and going forward. And so I just kind of was like I didn't see why Bond would like go back and save her and some of those elements either.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like Tanya more than Honey Rider, but again, that was my hot take for last week, was I think Honey Rider is sort of overrated as a Bond character. I think Tanya's fine, right? Like, I think in the pantheon of certainly Sean Connery, right? Or like the 60s Bond characters you want to kind of include on Her Majesty's Good Service, I think she's somewhere sort of in the middle for me, right? Like, I think, if Honey Rider gets a lot of buzz, but ultimately is there for like the last act, and I think isn't particularly, fantastic, right? Like, I think personally, I enjoy her performance more than that. Like, if she's not what like Honor Blackman is going to be in Goldfinger, right? Or Kissy Suzuki is going to be in Live Twice, or obviously Diana Riggs as Tracy, and on Match Good Service, sure, she's not as good as those, but like, to me, it's like, this is a totally fine Bond performance, right? Where like, I wasn't really distracted by her. Like some of the truly bad Bond female actress performances that I think kind of detract from the things. I thought her and Connery's performance, it's interesting, you talking about it kind of led me to realize that I think I sort of like it for the reasons you don't. I think I like the fact that it felt a little bit like they were each knowingly playing the other one, right? Like, it just felt from like the jump where they were just like, yeah, like, this isn't a real relationship. Like, when the first time you meet each other is just with her naked in his bed, it's like, yeah, like, we're buying into the fact that like in terms of these two characters, they each buy the fact that like, we know what this is. We know that this is a trap. We want to see where this is going to go. And I felt like she was a part of that just as much as he was. Certainly, it felt like he was always like, this is a game that we are playing. I don't necessarily know where the end is going to be, but I know what I want to go for. Right? Like, all the way to the scene of him and Red Grant on the train together, right? Where he's like, I have an escape route for one, right? And Bond's like, all right, like, I'm down to play a game and hear what this escape route is for just me, potentially. And I believe that just as much as I believed him actually enjoying his time with her, right? Like, it worked for me in a way. And I think it ties into the fact that one aspect I really like about From Russia with Love, which I think which is a lot of why I think people really love this film, is the fact that it is maybe the most like double crossing and where people's allegiances actually line of certainly the early Bond movies, right? Like, I like the fact that it feels like everyone is sort of playing each other, to the degree that where like, even when they're in Istanbul, right? Like, one of Kareem's sons is like, oh yeah, like they're like, it's like Station 137C's like tailing us today, right? Like, they're from Bulgaria, right? Like, tomorrow we'll tell them, kind of thing. Like, it's just done in the open. And it's like, I kind of liked that fact that like they're all just playing this big kind of game together. And certainly among the early Bond movies, this is the one that is the most like in the Cold War, right? Like, they're very much all the way until the last act of the game, maybe even really until the last like 25 minutes of the movie, no one knows that Spectre is the bad guy, right? Like, Bond is under the assumption, and so is MI6, that Russia is trying to trick them, and Tanya thinks that she's working for Russia and trying to trick the West, all this kind of stuff. Like, no one is aware that there's a larger power, and so it just does play as a like Cold War power dynamics. And I really like that, right? Like, this is just a Cold War espionage thriller, and I think it really highlights like the thriller aspect of the story, where a lot of Bond movies lose sight of that. This one, again, like Doctor No, but even more to me, is just like a detective thriller, right? Like, this would work as like a film noir story in a lot of ways. And I love that vibe, right? Like, I think watching it this time, I don't know if I love it as much as I have before, but on the same hand, right? Like, I legitimately do think that, like, pretty much from when Red Grant kills Nash and first makes contact with Bond, that like 15 to 20 minute chunk of time in the movie where they're on the train together, like talking, having dinner, and then the final scene back in the train compartment, like, I legitimately would rank among like the best of certainly Connery's Bond, if not any Bond, right? Like, that's a top 15 to 20 like chunk of a movie in the Bond series for me. Like, it's so good because it is everything the movie's been about, just like thrust to the forefront of just like they're each playing each other. They each kind of know they're playing each other, right? Like, I feel, for me at least, I felt like Bond from the very opening seconds, like, something's not right with this guy, right? And I love the fact that since Bond kind of knowingly went into a trap, he doesn't trust anyone necessarily. And so he kept kind of trying to dig deeper and, you know, dig around with more questions for Grant, right? And see, right? Like, for me, Bond immediately was like, oh, that was a weird thing that you said. And that was kind of a weird thing you said, right? And like him noticing Grant drugging Tanya, right? Like, Bond being quick to the game, right? And checking his briefcase, right? Like, I enjoyed that sequence so much. And it felt like that cat and mouse game you talked about obviously culminated into the final actual fight scene itself, which I think is great. I think it's a great Bond fight scene. And really gets into like the fact that Connery's Bond is just a brawler, right? It's kind of a bit more of a brutish fighting style. Certainly more than we see in Dr. No, but this is kind of how he's going to fight from here on out. And I love that, right? Like, I love that aesthetic of him just kind of using any tool necessary, anything he can, right? Just like fighting like people would actually kind of fight. See, I mean, that to me is sort of the highlight of the film. And then everything before that is built into that moment. In a lot of ways, my biggest critique of From Russia with Love might be the fact that you have that moment and that scene happen, and there's still so much of the film left, right? Like, the movie doesn't then like quickly end, right? We have him doing the like driving the truck, right, of flowers, and the helicopter scene happen, and then they have the scene in the water, and then they finally get to Venice in like the final scene, right? Like, if anything, my biggest critique is that the movie has too much packed after that, right? Because I feel like that was what we had been building to for so long, like this conversation between Grant and Bond.
It climaxes too early, yeah.
Yeah, like, I really liked From Russia with Love. I think, and I was kind of thinking about this earlier today, that, you know, this and Goldfinger, which is the next film, obviously, as it kind of teases at the end, really set the template for what a James Bond movie is, right? Like, Dr. No introduced Sean Connery, right? And like that Bond, but sort of like I mentioned last week, he's still very much kind of figuring out what and who Bond is. And I feel like this movie and Goldfinger really nailed down who James Bond is and what kind of stories we're telling and what kind of villains we're going to have, and really kind of laying that foundation of what a Bond story and what the templates are, and kind of the etch-a-sketch outline of what a story should be are filled in here. And it's sort of cool to see that. And it's, From Russia with Love is sort of neat too, because there aren't a lot of other Bond movies like that, right? Like, going forward, this is going to be one of the rare Bond movies, right? Like, it is one of the more grounded and simple stories, right? Like, it is not a plot to destroy the world or like get nuclear weapons or anything of the sort. It is a really simple, actual Cold War plot of like, the Russians have a machine that allows them to like decode messages. We want that so we can discover what their messages are. SPECTRE wants to get it to get money from Russia to give it back to them, and also to kill Bond for revenge. And like, all of that is very simple to understand. It is given out in like the first 5 minutes, and it's like, great, I know what this movie's about. And we won't really have another Bond plot this simple for like 20 years. As a spoiler alert, like, this is going to be the one that's like, all right, that's a simple enough plot. And I kind of like that too. And I think it's part of why Connery likes a lot in particular, is that it is just like, this is a film noir story. And I really enjoy that aspect of it.
Yeah.
In terms of moving on from there, we kind of went through a lot there, but like, I'll shift us to talking and really kind of focusing on Red, Grant, and Rosa Clubb here in our Villains Corner section of the pod within a pod. Trevor, if you had to talk about Grant and Clubb and how much you liked and didn't like them and how much they worked for you within the context of the movie, where are you at with those two baddies?
I mean, I liked, I think they work as a good duo. Where
I agree.
Grant,
the brains and the brawn.
Exactly. Yeah. Grant is the muscle, and she is kind of the mind behind everything. Kind of like enacting or trying to enact Kronstein's plan. And like, I mean, like she sets herself up as like incredibly menacing in that first introduction scene with Tanya. Where like we already have been introduced to the fact that she's playing this, young agent who doesn't know better. And it like the immediacy of like, and how many, like, and you've had 3 sexual partners? It's like, oh, okay. Yep. You're just going straight there. You're just not, no foreplay on this. Like I appreciate that. Like she immediately kind of sets herself up as that imposing threat that become like, it's hard to like, I wonder what it would have felt like at the time if she would have still felt like an imposing threat at the end of the movie versus like now, like where we just kind of laugh at like Bond kind of like pushing her away with a chair she's trying to like kick with the toxic blade kind of thing. Like she doesn't, and like, I mean, there's an element of it like even in the maid disguise or whatever, like she just doesn't feel like a threat at the end there. Like or she doesn't feel as threatening as she should. Like she pulls the gun, and I mean, both her and Grant like are victim to this in a way, in a significantly more like profound way, I think, than Dr. No was. Of they both, kind of set the stage for the monologuing that like villains will kind of have for decades to come, that eventually gets incredibly kind of torn down and made fun of in The Incredibles with Syndrome, because like Red does that, and that's how Bond finds out the whole plan with Spectre, is purely because Red kind of like lets him know all that information. And then she kind of does the same thing where like she should have just shot him and killed him based on everything that has been set up to that point of like this is why she's here. Why does she do the guise of like, as soon as his back is turned, she should just like take him out. And she doesn't. And then so she kind of gets taken out in like, almost embarrassing fashion as a result of all that. So because of like that, I would probably put Grant over her a little bit, because he at least like continues to be he continues to pose a threat. Like there's never a time like the only reason Bond ends up getting out of that is because of like the hidden knife gadget that that like was there and just happened to be in that room, really. So like he escapes more out of luck than anything else, and being able to like use his wit to enact on that or act on that luck. But like as a result, like Grant is another one, like he chooses his moment to suit his own sadistic needs that are kind of like set up as, he was an ex-con or whatever, or pulled out of like a mental hospital or something like that. So like I understand why he, doesn't just kill Bond at like the easiest, earliest opportunities that he has. And he kind of like, he plays with his food a little bit, because he is kind of like almost like a Hannibal Lecter type of like, it's a good way to put it. As much fun for him to like get the upper hand and show Bond that he has beaten Bond, as it like it's more fun for him to do that. Actually, he's going to get significantly more satisfaction out of that than if he had just taken Bond out at the Gypsy Yard or any of the other myriad of other opportunities he had while he was kind of like lurking in the shadows, like completely unawares to Bond throughout the whole rest of the film. So because of that, I think like he's a more interesting threat. So I would put Grant over Klebb myself.
I mean, I would agree. I mean, out of the three, I mean, we also, I guess, can decide here, but I'm prone to just rank henchmen and main villains together on our list.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I would have it be Grant, Rosa Klebb, and Dr. No probably right now as the ranking. Um, I think Grant is great, as I've mentioned many times. I think he's one of the more, even to like this day, I feel like he's one of the more menacing, almost wild card Bond villains, right? Like that whole sequence where, you know, Bond is on his knees and they're going back and forth, right? And it's like the first one won't kill you, the second one won't, either the third one won't, not until you come here and kiss my boot, right? Like, is a really dark kind of tone to it, right? And that whole, obviously the whole sequence of like the actual fight itself, which is lit in the dark, right? And him strangling Bond and all this kind of stuff, right? Like, I think they very much, like, from the minute he gets that gun on Bond, and I just watched a clip again before we recorded, and like the way his like face, the way his personality, the way everything just flips on a switch almost. You can see it in his face immediately just hardens, and the way he kind of addresses Bond, right, from his like fake British accent, it's such a great turn, and he is such a like peer, I think, for lack of a better word, with Bond, and like the levels and how good they're at kind of figuring out solutions, right? Like the reason that he keeps Bond around is so that Bond can just give them the Lecter machine directly in his lap, right? Just do the work for him is like a really smart thing, right? Like the Spectre wants a Lecter and they want to embarrass James Bond, and so right, they get like the porn tape of them basically from the hotel room and also like evidence to like discredit him, not just to like kill James Bond as revenge, but to discredit and embarrass him as revenge too. Like, is such a cool element of the story, I think, and Grant just kind of throwing it all out there. And even to your point, like even saying the reason I feel comfortable saying this is because you're like, it doesn't matter, right? Like, I've won. Yeah, I mean, it's a great sequence and it utilizes so much about both Connery and Shaw's personality so well. I think on displaying that scene, I think it's a great scene for Connery. But yeah, and I think he definitely gets more time to kind of chew in this movie than Rosa Klebb, who maybe gets as much time as he get in that one scene in the entire film.
Mm-hmm.
But I like Rosa Klebb for a lot of the same reasons you do, right? Where like it's cool to see that extra light shed on Spectre, right? And especially as a kid, I loved that shit, right? Because like I was watching the films in a very kind of weird way, where there would be like gaps in time before I would see the next one. And so like it was neat to see, oh shit, like there's number 2, like there's number 3 and number 5, and here's like another guy, number 1, like who is he? And like not knowing who number 1 was like such an exciting thrill. And then even once I knew who he was as a kid, like watching him again, being like, oh, like this is so exciting to see like where they're going before they actually get there, kind of thing. So like I love all the Spectre stuff. I think it adds such a really cool dynamic of like this third this third unseen player in the background, just kind of manipulating everything, that I feel like a lot of movies don't have, especially like a lot of action spy movies are pretty straightforward usually. And it's kind of neat to see, like a little bit like Iron Man 3, like there's just like a whole other power behind the actual scenes, who's the actual baddie. And just like Iron Man 3, it's good. But yeah, I mean, so I like the element, right? So I would agree ultimately that Red Grant is the top of our villains corner list, and then Rosa Klebb, and then Dr. No. But I do like Dr. No a bit more, which will probably come into a question as we go down the villain list. But for right now, yeah, it'd be Grant, Klebb, and No as the 3 ranked people on the villains corner section. Trevor, you already mentioned it once before, but what has or hasn't aged well in From Russia with Love?
I mean, the biggest thing for me that, like, so again, much like last week, in like looking up a lot of the stuff, there's still just a lot of like sexist bullshit like behind the scenes on these movies. Once again, like, oh, they're really only casting the Bond girls based on looks, based on like winning Miss America or Miss Universe pageants or something like that. Like I want the this Bond girl was like Miss Italy or something like that. So there's like very unsavory elements of that. But then like within the movie itself, like the whole gypsy sequence, not only for like the just like completely serves no purpose catfight nature of the sequence, but even like nowadays, like the aspect of like demonizing or what, like the stereotyping of like the gypsy culture that's kind of like shown there is just kind of like I feel like this is kind of like also very murky. And so like but more than anything, the fact that like none of it serves the greater plot of the movie, like you could pull out that entire detour, I feel like, and you don't gain or lose anything. So it just feels like padding to a movie, and the fact that it has like just random nonsensical pointless like stuff like that is an element that I feel like is rough. The like the it's not that I think it couldn't happen today, but I feel like it would need to be like almost less like it'd have to be more carefully set up or kind of established or something. But like Bond going in and just like immediately going to bang this woman, and then like the cut back to like, oh, the two-way mirror and like just pervy filming of this. It's like, okay, that's just a thing that's going to happen here. Okay. And then there's also like a couple elements of like just Bond's like backhanding and slapping a woman, and she should have kept her mouth shut, I think was a line that's in there somewhere. That's just like, especially knowing the extra like layers of like Sean Connery history and stuff, it's like, yeah, it just not a great look.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The gypsy sequence it's weird because I think the purpose it's there, the reason it's there is for the fight scene, right, that they have, so that Green Bay can get injured and then be like, I'm gonna kill him so they can kind of be done with this, right? Like, it's to get to that point, right? And the like iconic shot of like the guy coming out of the mouth, which is like a really famous Bond scene. I think, like you said, it didn't need. It's weird. Both of the first two Bond movies are short. Each one is like an hour and 50 minutes long. But in both, my biggest thing is be like, oh man, this would be a really tight hour and a half long film almost, right? Like if they just cut off like 20 minutes of these films, they'd be so tight, right? And the gypsy sequence is probably the thing I would just cut off like the first half of it, right? Like the cat fight sequence has literally no purpose.
Yeah.
There's no reason to be there, right? You could very easily have them get there, meet the like chief, and then basically have them at dinner and then everything pop off, right? Like that is a super simple thing for it to be done. And then lead into that fight sequence. Then Green Bay gets injured and then goes, I'm gonna kill him now, right? Like that, you could just cut that whole sequence out, right? Like
even that though, I
have any point.
Like I don't even understand how that, like, because before they go into that, they know Krillenko is the guy who blew up and tried to kill Karim Bey earlier in the day or whatever, and he only was saved by his like mistress woman, kind of like very boredly and blasé calling. And that's like, I guess that character is a whole other thing of like, okay, that's like, she is just in this movie as like a sexual object for that character, to show that he's, not 100% on the up and up, or like whatever that element is just like a whole other weird thing. But like that alone for me would be enough to set up like, he knows Krillenko's the threat, we need to take Krillenko out, so let's go. Like, we know where he's at, let's get him before he tries to get us again. Like, I feel like that could have just as easily been like the setup and payoff, as opposed to the setup happening, then them having this whole other gypsy sequence, and then like that leading to virtually the same payoff. But now Karim Bey has like an injured arm, and also the I did like laugh at like how bad that effect was. Like where you basically watch him like explode the squib on his own hand or on his own arm when he gets shot. Because it's set up, okay, he's been shot, and then like is almost immediately like, oh, it's not a problem anymore. Like he has a little bit of an issue taking that sniper shot, but not enough to where it warrants anything, and then he's perfectly fine after that. So like I just didn't know, it just ultimately doesn't, for me, it didn't serve any purpose at all in the plot, and you could just cut the whole thing and just kind of like go straight to the like sniping him and you're fine.
Yeah, I mean that's fair, right? I like the actual gunfight battle at the camp. I think that's a really cool sequence. But I mean it's you're not wrong for saying that they could cut from.
It's fine for an action sequence, but then it ends up just being action for action's sake or whatever. And it's like, okay, but like they didn't do a good enough job setting up that like to warrant it, really. Mm-hmm. Like, yes, now since they've set this up and we're here, fine, I'm along for the ride, and it's a fun, like, yes, there's fun little fight moments, and Bond saves, the head of the gypsies or whatever, and earns a favor, a la like a Godfather type of situation or whatever, and basically ends up earning the like both of the women that he gets saved. So yeah, another just like bad element there. So yeah, just kind of like it just. If I were to try and like remake the movie now, I would just be like, scrap that whole 20 minutes or whatever.
Sure. That's probably pretty fair. You
got
anything in particular?
You got any Logie hot takes for this one?
It's interesting. I think From Russia with Love is like my biggest hot take, I think, is the fact that I would love more Bond movies like From Russia with Love, right? Like, which maybe isn't that hot of a take. I don't know, but like, a lot of the movies, like I was thinking about this while watching it again now, I was just like, this is such a cool Cold War thriller, right? Like, the Russians almost literally won't be in a Bond movie again for like 15 years after this. They'll have like mentions, but like not really involved. Like they're like active participants here. And like, I would have loved more this time period, right? Like, because really we get the Russians a lot in like the 70s and 80s, but that kind of Cold War period feels different than like the early 60s, like right as the Cuban Missile Crisis either happens or just happened, right? Like that very fresh early Cold War period, right? It's like the wall goes up in Berlin. It's such a cool time period for like stories, right? Like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. And so like I would have loved to have seen more Cold War Bond stories, right? And like it's a weird kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because in the trade-off for not getting more Soviet KGB, stories in the 60s, we get Spectre instead. And I'm someone who loves the Spectre storyline in the Bond movies, right? It's like, it's hard to complain because we get really good movies and really great stories out of it. But man, like this like one-off we get of just like, that is what a cool actual like Bond espionage thriller would look like. It's really good. And I would love to have seen how they could have evolved that dynamic more. I will say also, that's the end of the hot take. Because that just reminded me of something. I do like the fact that Red Grant mentions how they learned about 007 and his interrogation of Bond. He mentions like, oh, like we got one of your like, brethren out in Tokyo, and before we like killed him, he gave us your like code name, basically, like the 007 thing. And like, oh, that's a cool way to explain how they would know everything, because obviously in Dr. No, it would have just ended and no one would have been like there. And so it's cool to be like, oh yeah, like we got it out of another agent from you who basically like turned as we were killing him, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I mean, I would have loved more movies like this, but I also understand why we didn't get more, because they invested more in the Spectre storyline.
Yeah. Back on like elements that maybe have aged well. I don't know if they've aged well, as like they didn't age terribly. I will say like the boat sequence and the helicopter sequence.
Yeah.
If like the helicopter sequence, especially if it hadn't run 4 times longer than it needed to.
It is very
it's like, it just feels like it's the same shots like flying overhead kind of stuff like that. And it's just like, why why are we just continually flying overhead and watching like James Bond or the stuntman kind of like duck into knolls or whatever? Like what like I appreciate the ending of it and how like like Bond kind of like hides in there, gets a guy and the grenade drops and whatever. But the like it just goes a little bit long. But then like the boat sequence, I appreciated it. It's like it's set up. They've got all these fuel things on the boat. It was, you know, like they do the setup of like, here's why this boat was here, because it was how Grant was going to get out of here. So kind of like that whole thing. Like there's an element of like, you know, it's how did the bad guys find him in the open seas so quickly or whatever, but you know, whatever.
From the boat meeting and then immediately was just like there.
Yeah.
Sure. Totally fair.
But I appreciate then like the payoff of, okay, well they shot at the thing, and even though the guy's telling them like don't shoot at the explosive stuff, we want him
I
like
that.
We want them alive at this point, or we want the Lecter, you know, whatever their reason. They don't want everybody dead, but like the henchmen just keep shooting anyway. And I appreciate that they had set up that they have like those flares too, and so like Bond launches a flare and sets the whole ocean ablaze kind of thing on them.
I love the fact that based on that too, the fact that it is the rare villain problem of your henchmen being too accurate with guns.
Yeah.
They're too good at shooting, right? Like that very rarely happens. And yeah, they can't help but just keep shooting grenades too close to the boat and shooting the barrels, right? It's a really funny problem for that end as well, right? And then they kind of their accuracy leads to their own doom, right? The training paid off too well that we see in the beginning of the film.
Yeah. That was another. I appreciated the evil compound at the beginning, the whole thing as well. Like
it's great, right?
This element, like not only the payoff to the end of the cold open of like, all right, like they you know take the stopwatch or whatever. It took you a minute and 52 seconds to kill him or whatever. Like cool, like so they've got this kind of thing set up as an obstacle course. But then when we come back and we get kind of the long walk to Grant, we see the firing range. We see people like practicing hand to hand stuff. We see just a guy shooting a flamethrower. Like I appreciate there's just like a ton of stuff also going on there at this Spectre compound that like in some ways we do kind of see payoff later of how those henchmen, you know, serve on the boat.
I love the Spectre storyline, right? And you're beginning to see the fact that these Connery movies are all tied together, right? Which is what I always talk about. And what we get here, because like Dr. No really is just a name, right? We don't really get anything beyond that. And here we kind of see what Spectre is, and it's got the secret base and these numbered systems and all this kind of stuff. And Blofeld given the line of, right, like, Spectre is the fish that waits for the two to tire each other out, which is it's a whole great monologue. And I love that, right? Like, I love the kind of lore around the organization, and we'll get more of it down the line. It's just cool to see, I think. And it's a villain backstory, I guess, or villainous organization backstory that really works for me, right? Like, it gives me exactly what I need to know, right? Like, these people are being pulled because they're criminals, right? Like, Rosa Klebb came from Russia and had worked there and then turned bad. And, you know, Kronstein gives this whole speech, right, about, like, the criminal mind, like, being so clever kind of stuff. And I think it's just cool to see the people that are like the number 3 and number 5 baddies, like not necessarily the top of the food chain, but like where they came from and what their stories are and their dynamics. It's all really worked for me, and it's a really cool sequence.
On that, one of the things you touched on was like this as a continuation, which I realized like you and I talked about off mic last week when we talked about the movie, but I appreciate that like it picks up and we've got Sylvia Trench and Bond together, like back there in London, and like she's just kind of his fling there back home, and we got kind of like the little continuation of that story, and we get like continued flirtation with Moneypenny, which I also like. It hasn't like crossed a line, I don't think, or at least I don't like in my mind it hasn't crossed a line where it's like
I don't
oh,
think
this
so.
is like a workplace harassment kind of thing, because like they're clearly both into it and they're both having fun.
Yeah.
And it seems like it is an understood thing on both parties that it's like flirtation for flirtation's sake. Um, uh, but I appreciated like, I will say, going back to kind of my comments about like the relationship between Bond and Tiana or Tanya, like I thought the brief bits we get with Bond and Moneypenny or Bond and Trench are infinitely better
100%
chemistry
agree. I
than
will agree to
anything
that.
with Tanya. So
I will absolutely
that's
agree to that.
another like just aspect of like, by comparison, I don't buy anything that's really happening between the two of them, even if they are trying to like play one another or whatever. Like, it's just such a murky thing that like the relationship gets no buy-in from me.
That's totally fair, right? Like Lois Maxwell is a national treasure, right? Like she's so good as Moneypenny and will be Moneypenny for by far the longest of any actress that's going to play her. Um, and her chemistry with Sean Connery and Roger Moore in particular, um, is so good, right? Like it is so effortless. It feels like, and there will be future Moneypennies whose relationship with Bond feels the balance isn't quite right, I think, in terms of like her being too into him versus not, versus like, whatever it might be, and like the flirtation just doesn't, it's just not right. But it very much feels like you said, like they're both in on it, right? Like it does feel like friendly flirting and like friendly kind of back and forth banter, right? And they'll give like Moneypenny will give it as good as she gets it, kind of thing, which is I think important. Um, and so I mean, Lois Maxwell is just great, right? Her chemistry is great, and then Sylvia Trench is cool. Like it is cool to see that connective tissue tie over. This is unfortunately going to be her last appearance in the series, um, but she is cool to kind of have that dynamic of like, yeah, there is a Bond life outside of these missions almost, which I really enjoy. I like this. These missions are not necessarily his whole life. There are these glimpses into it, and he does have a London girlfriend back home, right? And he's got these other kind of things going on in his life.
Oh,
Even in Doctor No, we see him at the casino, like doing other things that aren't just being a spy.
yeah. Also, shout out to again a thing that like, ahead of its time, the car phone that Bond has
Yeah,
at the top
I
of the movie
thought
there
that today.
in that scene with Trench.
Hmm.
Like 20 years ahead of like the real thing easily, probably.
Yeah, at least yeah. It is. Yeah, like James Bond is really cool at predicting technology things, right? And in some ways, possibly like inspiring people to be like, "Oh shit, that would be cool." Um, yeah, and the car phone is a great example of that. I also have always, for no particular reason, loved the image of him, like his like foot hanging in the water with like the wine bottle, and then like him pulling it out. It's just a cool sequence when he's with Sylvia Trench to begin in. Just like cool the wine quicker. But yeah, I mean, From Russia with Love is I think, very of its time and place movie that also, to me at least, has sort of a timeless feel to it. And I think that's why it has kind of endured so long.
Uh,
But in sort of wrapping.
Sorry, one other thing, real quick, just going back to like the gypsy sequence, because I just remembered,
Mhm.
like, oh, that's right. The gypsy sequence also is the only justification for like the opening montage
Yeah,
sequence of belly dancing stuff. Um,
that's going to tie in really well to where I'm going to go
and
next.
it's
So
just
sorry.
like another element of like that didn't need to be the aesthetic for this, and
Mhm.
because you set that up as the aesthetic for this and then have like the payoff be like a completely throwaway, just like, well, we just really wanted to get to a belly dancing scene. I like, it's just another like, I yeah, none of that worked for me.
Speaking of which, the theme, um, yeah, like you said, like it is gonna set a template for a lot of just scantily clad women shots in the opening credits, which is gonna define the opening credits at least through the Roger Moore run of films. So for the next like 25 years, um, I think the opening credits are good. I think they're fine, right? Like I think I much prefer this than like not really having one in the prior movie, right? And I think the prologue is great, right? Like I think the actual like Red Grant hunting down the fake Bond is an awesome sequence. Um, in terms of like the music itself, I mean, it's better than Three Blind Mice, which is what we got in the last movie, right? Like,
I mean, I thought Three Blind Mice was a better,
did you really
intro number than this? Yeah,
Hmm.
especially because like this, I was just like, I don't. How is this the Bond theme for From Russia with Love? Because you don't get From Russia with Love until the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm. Or played briefly on the radio when he's with Trench.
So like that music better than Three Blind Mice, but the non like the generic belly dancing music that we get kind of like in the opening sequence, I was just like, this isn't doing anything for me.
It's weird. I mean, I guess I speak more to the From Russia with Love theme itself, which I really love. It's like a very 60s stylish kind of song.
And that was fine, but it is not this opening theme kind of numbers.
No, yeah. It's a weird choice. Like I would love to, and like the reason I'm sure goes back to the fact they wanted the opening like credit sequence to be like the belly dancers. But it was a very interesting decision to make it that instead of the actual From Russia with Love theme that people think of when they think of this movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it has no competition, so technically it is the best prologue and opening credit sequence you've seen so far, because the last one didn't have one. Trevor, what's your final review of Doctor?
Do we want to do
From Russia with Love?
Do we want to do Q Lab?
I thought we kind of already went over it, but like I'm more than happy to kind of run over the briefcase because it's an awesome gadget. And again, it ties back into, I think, the fact that this is one of the more grounded and real Bond movies, and we get this very practical briefcase, right? Like with the knife and like the doubloons, basically.
Mm-hmm. Golden sovereigns, yeah.
Yeah, right. And the like packet of deodorant at the top, which is such a cool idea. Like I love like. I've always loved the payoff of him just being like this way and that to open it, and it won't go in this way and it will. Like it's such a cool, and obviously like the sniper rifle gets so much usage. Like it's such a cool, handy like package that is so practical that he uses everything, both because it's a movie and also because like he would use all those gadgets on like an actual mission he would go on. But yeah, it is a staple of the sensible Bond gadget, which are not that freaking, but it is a classic for that reason.
When it gets introduced, I was like, okay, like the knife, I can see how the knife's going to come in play. I can see how the sniper rifle is going to come in play. I can see how tricking somebody into opening the briefcase and like setting off the tear gas canister is going to come in play. I was definitely like, I don't understand how the gold coins are going to come into play. How's that going to be a thing? And so like when it comes down at the end of like he uses those gold coins to try and like bribe Grant, I was like, oh, okay, that's a clever idea. And then he's able to use that to like deceive Grant into opening the other briefcase without kind of the little opening trick. So like I appreciated the two layers of that payoff.
One thing I liked about that sequence too is how Bond asks for a cigarette and Grant just goes, not a chance, right? Because Spectre obviously has like cyanide and like special cigarettes kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So Grant being like, oh, this could be a trick. Like you could have like a cigarette that like shoots a dart out at me or something like that, right? And so him just immediately being like, nope, not a chance in hell. Was like also a nice callback to the last movie and its cigarettes. Yeah, I mean, even like it's not a Bond gadget, but like Grant's like choker, like garrote.
Oh yeah, the garrote in the watch. Yeah, that's
such a cool gadget as well. And that is used so much throughout the film that Grant just loves to strangle people to death. And then obviously that being his like signature weapon, being his downfall, is a very like I love that twist on it. Yeah, I mean, it is a great gadget. And a great like cue selection. It has the misfortune, I think, of having to come right before just so many iconic cue gadgets that are going to be in Goldfinger, that I think it kind of gets forgotten. But like this is one of I think the stronger of the Connery. Certainly a combination of one of the stronger and one of the most practical of the Connery gadgets we're going to get.
Yeah.
Because there are some that are cooler, but I can't say that there are many that are more practical than this briefcase.
Yeah. I mean, like Bond says, like it's the standard kit that everybody gets, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate that as just kind of like a like almost in a weird meta sense of like laying the groundwork for Q gadgets to come. Here's
100%.
Here's like a standard kit to start like preparing audiences for. He's going to have more than just a gun.
Right down to the fact that it is the first appearance of Desmond Llewellyn as Q, right? Beginning a 36-year-long relationship with the franchise, right? Like he will be in every single movie from this point out except for one until 2000. And so it's also important for that aspect. One thing I'll also tie on to that is the fact that this movie, for that reason you just said, Trevor, is super important because Bond gadgets are not a part of the novels. They are not really a element of the novels at all, essentially. And so what we get here really does lay the kind of audience expectation and foundation of like what to expect for future Bond movies, right? And they start off very simple, very practical. They will obviously grow outlandish at times, but it is super important to kind of get that audience buy-in because it is not something that is carried over from the novels. This is one of the bigger things that will deviate from the novels, especially going forward. And so to kind of see it start here and see, our first appearance of Q is super important to obviously what the franchise will become down the line. Yes. Otherwise, Trevor, what is your final recap, your final thoughts on From Russia with Love?
I mean, like, overall, I enjoy it more than Dr. No overall, but the core central relationship between Bond and Tanya does bring it down from making that like a clear runaway.
Sure.
So it's probably still in the same kind of ballpark of like a B plus range for it's not like I can grading on a curve. I would give I could give this an A out of these two or whatever, but I just really like there was just no the lack of chemistry there just made me not care about one half of the central couple / dynamic throughout the chunk of the bulk of the movie, and like you said, Honey Rider comes in for the third act or whatever, so if that didn't work, it doesn't hurt the whole rest of the movie in the way that this for me hurts most of the movie.
It's a big part, yeah.
And I'm just kind of just get rid of leave her on the train. I don't why are you bringing her? Why is this continuing? Stop it. So yeah, that was kind of a downer overall, but ultimately I still put this above Dr. No, at least by a little bit.
Yeah, for me it is definitely ahead of Dr. No. I'll be really curious to see out of the first 5 movies we kind of do if anything will fall below Dr. No. Like I said at the top, I think this and Goldfinger are going to lay the foundation and the template for what a Bond movie is going to be for the next 40, 50 years, right? Those movies kind of really establish a lot of the big blonde templates, stereotypes, whatever you want to call it. I think Sean Connery is great in this. I think this performance is one of his very strongest in the series, because he still cares and is invested, which will not be the case in certainly his last appearance, but arguably other ones as well. And the fact that he gets to just be this kind of character that is playing so many different sides, right, and kind of always on his guard and doesn't necessarily believe anything, I think allows a really cool version of what James Bond is. I like his and Cream Bay's dynamic. I like Cream Bay in general. I think he's a really cool, again, kind of setting a template of maybe sort of a shady friend, but a friend nonetheless, kind of character. Moneypenny's great here, right? Red Grant, I think, is a iconic villain who very easily could be near the like top chunk of villains by the time the show comes to a close. In a lot of ways, I agree that Tanya is among the weakest parts of the film. I think she's very much fine throughout the whole thing. But I think so much works around her, and in particular, those moments where Sean Connery and Robert Shaw are together have so much chemistry and like I think electricity that it just gives the film so much life in that like 15-minute section. That to me it is pretty clearly a step above what came before it in Doctor No. But I also would agree that it is the best of what we've seen so far. And I think will, for me, in a lot of ways, be sort of a benchmark Bond movie, right? Like, From Russia with Love is not my favorite. I don't expect it to be in my top 3, right? But I do very much expect From Russia with Love to be in the top 10 by the time we end. And, like, I think it is a fair bellwether for, like, spots like 7 or 8. And so it is sort of set in the benchmark for, like, what we're grading these Bond movies are. Possibly it's going to get replaced by that one movie from now. But it is sort of set in the template of like, all right, this is what we're grading on. This is what we're looking at. How is the movie better or worse than From Russia with Love from here? And I'm excited to see how the future films go from this point on.
Real quick, just a thought bouncing off of you mentioning kind of Kareem Bey and kind of the relationship between him and Bond. I like obviously Lucas and Spielberg end up kind of pulling from a myriad of different references for Indiana Jones, but like I very much can see like an Indiana Jones Salah relationship there, kind of influenced by From Russia with Love. And also I gotta, just because I keep every time I say From Russia with Love, I think about it. And I think about the thing I mentioned to you last time. It boggles my mind when Bond is there talking to Moneypenny and writes with love from Russia. I'm just like, why did he do it that way? Why didn't he just say the name of the movie or do like write it the name of the movie?
Roll credits.
It's weird. It's just weird. just the order of him writing on that prop. I was like, I'm so confused right now. This hurts my brain so much. It shouldn't, but it does. Why did you do it that way? Who writes that? Who writes it like that? Who writes with love and then goes back and like starts the thing to write From Russia?
But there we go. We have decided, From Russia with Love is currently at the top. Dr. No is currently second or last, depending on how mean you want to be. And that is the ranking thus far. I'm very curious to see kind of how we go. Like I was looking at the kind of box set, the way they broke it up into, in terms of like, the first 10 movies of like 1962 to 77, that run. And I was looking, I was like, oh man, this really could be like 6 of the top 10 movies are just right here potentially. Like it is an incredibly strong run. And then you get to like the 79 to like 02 era, and then the 5 Daniel Craig movies. I'm very, very curious to see how these kind of movies evolve from here on out. Really, that's it. If you like what you heard, you can go find Trevor Starkey at Trevor J. Starkey on the internet. Trevor, anything that you want to plug or shout out?
Based on when this episode is going to go live, you can go keep an eye around here in January for our Game of the Year 2021 stuff. Kind of hear our final thoughts and wrap-ups whenever that's going live, but it should be sometime around this time. Keep an eye out for all of that.
I will echo that shout out. You can find me at LeftyLogie, at LeftyLogie on the internet, LOGGY. Check out all of our Game of the Year and End of the Year content. It is sure to be a good time. I'm sure we will have thoughts on The Matrix as well when that comes out in a few weeks for us, but a few weeks ago for you, and what that movie looks like. And maybe even The Kingsman, a movie very much inspired by James Bond as well. So check out for all of that. You can go look at That Nerdy Site at That Nerdy Site all across the internet, and youtube.com/That Nerdy Site, as well as thatnerdysite.com for all of the content and coverage there. Otherwise, for myself, for Trevor, and for all of us here at That Nerdy Site, we will see you next week when we return with Goldfinger.